My name is Austin Olney. I'm the digital media specialist at the library. I want to thank everyone for coming. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Beth Kava, who is the president of the White Plains Library Foundation.
Thank you, Austin, and welcome to you all. As you know, we had expected to celebrate the Foundation's 25th anniversary in March, and to hear Erik Larson speak about his new book at that event soon after its publication. Although that was not to be, we are so fortunate to now be together virtually for an Erik Larson book talk, made even more special because many of us have been able to read The Splendid and the Vile. At this most difficult time for our community and our nation, we will have the opportunity to hear about another fear-filled time 80 years ago, and to learn about the ability of human beings to endure and overcome that fear and adversity. A thanks to Brian Kenny, our library director, and to Nancy Rubini, the Foundation's executive director, for their work in making this event happen. Some of you got your books delivered by Nancy and other members of the Foundation board. And thanks to the library's digital media specialist, Austin Olney, who you just met, whose tech expertise allows us to be apart and yet together in this virtual space. You'll hear from Nancy at the end of the program. Some brief thoughts about the library and the Foundation in this challenging time. Brian and his library staff, many of whom are here tonight, have provided the White Plains community with an incredible richness of programs and resources to keep us reading, talking to one another, and learning from experts and from each other. Programs and resources which are growing each month. We are so grateful to our fabulous, intrepid library staff. And it is because of your generosity as Foundation donors, your love of the library, and your belief in its mission that many of these programs have been able to be presented. Foundation funds have supplemented city support in providing the necessary technology, staff training, and support for staff initiatives that have allowed the library to serve the community in ways unimaginable on March 14th, the date our gala was supposed to occur. Thank you, donors, and we look forward to providing more opportunities like this one to celebrate your longtime support. Joining us this evening is White Plains Mayor Tom Roach. We have heard him many times these past weeks informing us, encouraging us, and reminding us that we are standing together by staying apart. It's nice to be able to see him as well as hear him tonight. Mayor Roach.
And thank you very much, Beth. And you can, in seeing me, you can see that I am waiting for Tuesday when the barbershops reopen.
Yeah.
You know, if
you're
not
alone,
you not suddenly have a haircut in the middle of a time when no one else can have one, and it's getting a little extreme. But I'm really pleased to be here with everyone, and I second Beth's comments. You know, I'm a people person, and I was looking at my calendar for June today, and there's nothing on it. I'm so busy, but there's no events. And normally I'd be attending maybe 3 events a night, 6 events on a weekend, and getting to see everybody. And I think we're all starved of that interaction. And so I thought this was a great idea to kind of try and handle this unprecedented situation that we're in. I would say that Brian and I've been mayor longer than Brian's been director. I'm proud to say that he became a director, and thanks to our great board, and has done a wonderful job. But we've been through Superstorm Sandy when the library really stepped up, and really we've gone through a time when people proclaimed the death of libraries. As a kid who was a library rat, who loved to be in the library, who loves to read to this day. Have enjoyed Dead Calm, particularly Mr. Larson, and looking forward to the new book. It was a little bit scary, but our library certainly rose to the challenge and is busier than ever. And I think in this pandemic, our library has demonstrated how libraries are more than just books. They are the center of the community, and in times of crisis, they become even more vital. So I'm excited about our next step is to open up the return window to bring your books back, which I thought was great, that we're going to open that first. And then the week after, we're going to start having order your books and come pick them up, contactless delivery of reading material and all the other material the library provides. So we're doing everything we can to make that happen. And I want to give a special thank you, all the people watching who have supported us, continue to support this library, the benefactors who make this possible. We've got a beautiful facility with wonderful staff, and it's one of the major parts of why our city we have such a diverse population. We have such great kids going out into the world, such wonderful results in our schools, and it doesn't come just from the schools, it doesn't come just from the parents, it comes from a full community getting together. And I think there's no better expression of community than a public library. Without public libraries and public schools, I don't think you have a democracy, a true democracy. So thank you all for participating. I'm excited to hear the interview tonight. I've been looking forward to it all day. And with that, I'll hand it off to Oren.
Hand it off to me.
Oh, I'll hand it back to Beth.
Have to hand it back.
One good thing about Zoom is I can see everybody's face. So I can see Beth shake her head now. So right over to Beth.
It's okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Tom. I think I can speak for all of us that we look forward to the time when this crisis is past and we can go back to the old days of hearing you tell us about changes in holiday recycling schedules.
Yes.
And now I have the pleasure of introducing Oren Teicher. Oren recently retired from his position as the CEO of the American Booksellers Association, which works to strengthen and expand independent bookstores nationwide. The National Book Foundation recently presented him with the 2019 Literarian Award for Outstanding Service to the American literary community in honor of his leadership and advocacy. He's much more than this brief introduction, but one important thing is that he lives right here in White Plains, and he is a library lover. Oren will moderate the conversation with Erik Larson, who will be using some of the questions submitted by you. So I turn it over to him to introduce the guest of honor and get things going. Thank you, Oren.
Thank you. Beth, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And Erik, let me extend a virtual welcome to the city of White Plains.
Thank you.
As has been said, we would have much preferred to be doing this in person, but we certainly hope that this will be a decent substitute. We are eagerly looking forward to the conversation. As my bookselling friends and my friends and family know, I've been a fan of yours for a long time, way back to when Isaac Storm was first published, and certainly through Devil in the White City, Thunderstruck, Dead Wake, Garden of Beasts, and of course now with Splendid and the Vile. One of the cool things I got to do as working at ABA all those years was every Christmas I got to go out and work in a bookstore. And one of the things I always told the stores where I was going, I said, well, you better be sure you stock up on your Erik Larson inventory, because that's going to be the go-to book, which I'm going to be able to hand sell. And I'm pleased that I probably sold a few of your books over all of those years. It was a lot of fun.
So you're saying that I owe my kids' college educations to you?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
For sure. You've always managed to put the reader right into the story that you're telling. I've said to some folks that in this recent book, in The Splendid and the Vile, I kind of think that there are moments there when you actually can even smell the rubble burning in London. Before we start, and I want to ask you a lot about Winston Churchill. I know you've said before that there was an interesting kind of personal story and motivation that occurred about why it was you chose to write this book, which I think would be of real interest, particularly to those of us who happen to live in New York and those of us who were here in 2001.
Yeah. So as a footnote, first of all, I did not, at the inception of this book, I did not intend to write about Winston Churchill. That came later. The inspiration, if you will, for this book came from the fact that my wife and I, 5 years ago, moved from Seattle to Manhattan. In Seattle, we had raised three daughters. They went off to do what they do, as children are wont to do. We moved to Manhattan. When I came to Manhattan, I had kind of an epiphany about the meaning of 9/11 here in the city versus for the rest of us who may have watched it in real time as we did. But when I got here, I just realized in a very vivid way that 9/11 was a very different experience here in the city. Not only could people see the smoke, hear sirens and so forth, but there was that added trauma of knowing that your home city was under attack, that you were vulnerable. And suddenly I started thinking, well, given how much that shook us, it still has sent us for a loop. Given how much that event shook us, that one event, I started wondering how on earth did the citizens of London endure the Blitz, with the first phase of which had 57 consecutive nights of bombing, 57, if you will, 57 consecutive 9/11s. And so I started thinking, how on earth did anybody survive that? And that maybe that would be an interesting book to write. So I started looking at first for thinking about finding the quintessential London family, some typical family to write about their experience. And that's when I started thinking, well, wait a minute, why not write about Churchill? Churchill and his family and his advisors, how did they fare during that German air campaign, which essentially spanned the first year of his prime ministership? And so that's what got me into the story. Once getting into the story, I realized how much material had already been done about Churchill, and I just about ran screaming the other direction.
So talk a little bit about the Blitz and what it really was like for folks who lived in London. Obviously, a lot of us these days have had some disruption in our lives given events of these past months. Is that a comparison that makes any sense? Are there things that we're all experiencing that were comparable to what folks in London experienced in 1940?
Well, I don't want to take the comparison too far. I mean, there are parallels. To me, the biggest parallel is simply the fact that to get through this, we all have to pull together. It just so happens that the heroic thing is staying home. And actually, I think if Churchill were alive today, I think he would do a speech where, in fact, he would celebrate the quotidian heroism of people who are staying home, because honestly, where people are alone, people are losing jobs, people are going hungry, and the goal is to suppress this virus. And we all have to pull together. In Churchill's time, everybody had to pull together, but maybe in a different way. One benefit, I hate to say it, but one benefit that they had during the Blitz was that at least during the day, after the campaign shifted to nighttime bombing, at least during the day, they could go out and have fun. They could hang out together and go to the pub. But anyway, but there are parallels. And what I find fascinating, Oren, actually, is that, I hear this time and time again, is that people are coming to my book for solace. And I find that, well, at first I found it kind of astonishing. Now I get it. But, basically what we're talking about here is people are coming to my book, to a book essentially about mass death, carnage, and capricious, things happening to people for solace. So that's an index of maybe how bad things are. But I do think that there are parallels, and I believe the main parallel is that we all have to pull together.
Churchill, you describe in some, almost humorous detail how Churchill conducted business from his bed and from his bathroom. So he kind of, maybe was one of the first stay-at-home, work-at-home guys. Is that he would have been, do you think, comfortable in this environment?
That's interesting. I think actually he would have been comfortable in this environment. Churchill, when he woke up in the morning, about 8:30 in the morning, he would work from his bed. He would sit in bed smoking a cigar. He would have a tumbler full of water and a little whiskey. and he would be dictating endlessly to his long-suffering but adoring private secretary. Then he would get up and he'd have his bath, he'd get up, and he'd continue dictating memoranda and so forth. I think he actually would have been just fine quarantining, especially at the Prime Ministerial Country House Chequers, which is where he spent many of his weekends during the war. So yeah, I think he would have been just fine. Whether he would have been able to figure out Zoom, I don't know.
You said acknowledge there's been a lot written about Churchill, stuff by him, and the Churchill archive is pretty extensive, which is a little different from some of the other people you've written about who have been a little more obscure, to say the least, and less known to history. So tell us a little bit about what it was like writing about somebody who was so well known. And were there things that you discovered about him that you didn't know or you don't think had been written about before?
Well, first of all, I would say this is probably the hardest book I ever did, mainly because of that aspect, that so much had been done before. And I kept asking myself, well, why am I doing this? What benefit, what net benefit am I providing the world by doing another book about Churchill? But the thing was that I had my very specific lens. My lens was to look and try and find out how on earth did Churchill, his family, and his close advisors, his so-called secret circle, how did they all manage to endure this prolonged German air campaign? I mean, how did they do it on a daily basis? I found it unfathomable. I mean, as I said, I'm a father of 3 daughters, and my daughters think of me as the king of anxiety. How on earth did parents, get through that period with their kids, just as susceptible as they were to random death from the air, because German bombing was not terribly accurate. So it was with that lens that was very helpful. I made a strategic decision. Usually I like to read everything about a subject or a person before I even begin. In this case, that would have been a fool's errand. So I made a strategic decision that I was going to read as much as I could tolerate, actually, about Churchill, to get a sense of the lay of the land, the Churchillian landscape, the high points, the strategies, the so forth. And then I was going to jump right into the archives, because that's where, first of all, I feel very, very comfortable. And second, because I had this fresh lens. Nobody had done that before, as a matter of fact, is to look at specifically at how the Churchill and family managed to get through that particular period. So I was confident that with my lens, once I got into the archives, that I would be able to find new things, not necessarily things that other scholars had not come across, but things that they hadn't necessarily used. One of my favorite elements of the book is that I was given access to Mary Churchill's diary. Mary was the Churchill's youngest surviving daughter at the time the action begins in the book. She was 17 years old. Mary kept a terrific, eloquent, warm, engaging, funny daily diary, which I was blessed to be given access to. One of, at the time, 2 people who was permitted to take a look at this. And she is wholly new as far as any kind of work on Churchill is concerned. So I count that as a coup. But there's also an awful lot of material that I managed to get from British intelligence interrogations of Luftwaffe pilots, from also looking at some of Churchill's advisors in a different way as how they all got through this. Also, like key characters in the book are Frederick Lindemann, the prof, who was Churchill's personal scientific advisor, hated by everybody in Whitehall, the seat of British government, but a very effective guy at galvanizing ministers who may have fallen down on the job. And there was also Lord Beaverbrook, who I adore, also hated by everybody, whom Churchill put in charge of the Ministry of Aircraft Production, a whole new ministry, in order to ramp up the production of fighter aircraft, which Churchill recognized right away was the key to staving off an invasion by Germany after France fell.
Eric, you write at length about Churchill's leadership skills and how he brought this extraordinary group of people together to get things done, and the unique way in which he managed to communicate with the British people during the Blitz and throughout the Second World War. Without overdoing the analogies to our world today, are there things that you observed in Churchill's leadership style that do have ramifications today? Are there things that he did that perhaps some of our current governmental leaders might learn from?
Oh, I think they might learn from it indeed. Oh, well, where do I begin? I mean, Churchill was a leader. First of all, one of Churchill's strengths, which is utterly absent, I believe, at the moment in a certain quarter, is that he had a strong moral core. He was a man who knew right from wrong. He had compassion. He had empathy. He was not afraid of weeping in public. And that's a very important element, I believe, of leadership in a time of crisis, being able to convey a sense of sympathy and sharing the pain of his audience. But the things that I feel would be most applicable. First of all, Churchill, as we know, was an excellent orator. I mean, he was well read. He was a terrific writer. He dictated his speeches. Now think about that. Think about dictating a 2-hour speech. I mean, that's a tremendous gift. But we're all familiar with his flashing oratory, things like, never has so much been owed by so many to so few in terms of the RAF and the Battle of Britain. But in fact, his speeches, I came to believe that his speeches, there was much more to them than those rhetorical flourishes. The structure that not followed, of course, in every speech, but what I was able to discern is that, he was very dedicated in his speeches to telling the truth, telling the reality of what was happening, sometimes with detail that would terrify his audiences. But he felt that it was very important to tell his audience the truth, which makes perfect sense because his audience knew what the truth was. If you start giving your audience happy talk when they know there's a different reality, suddenly you have a dissonance, and then trust and morale begin to sag. So he would begin his speeches with this very detailed, sober assessment of what was happening in the world. But then he would follow with real cause for optimism, real specific things. Yes, we're down on the ropes, but there is this. We could do this. There is this that could happen. And then at closing his speeches, that's when he would do these great rhetorical flourishes that would, get people rising from their chairs, just willing to get out there in the street and do battle with the Germans. Now, of course, that's not something we want people to do now. We want them to do exactly the opposite, is stay home with more resolve, But anyway, he was very, very good at that. But also, another thing that was, I think, amazing about Churchill. Again, he was very well read. He had a great understanding of the grand sweep of British history. And his role, and also the role of Britain at his time in that. And he had a way in his speeches of making his listeners feel as though they were part of that grand history, that this was not just them trying to save their own necks. This was the populace of London participating in, the equivalent of the great Battle of Trafalgar, and he had that way. Of course, that requires the words and the knowledge, and he had that. So there are many of those things could really be applicable. Also, though, very important to me in terms of what happens in this book is that I really believe that I came to believe that courage is infectious. And Churchill was very aware of the power of symbolic acts, that things that he did would be communicated to others and might actually help embolden them. For example, visiting bombed out areas after the Germans had attacked, or as was his habit, when there were air raids, Churchill would go to the nearest roof to watch the attack, right? And of course, people came to understand that as well. But he had this way of conveying, I think he taught the British people to be fearless, and that's a real knack. But of course, in order to do that, you have to be fearless to begin with.
One of the recurring themes of the book throughout the year that you write about is the effort by Churchill and the British government to convince Roosevelt and the Americans to enter the war.
Right.
And obviously, which didn't happen until after the exact period that you were writing about, until December of 1941, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And of course, for at least 6 months of the narrative that you write about is during the 1940 presidential campaign, in which FDR is out every day telling the American people that he's never going to send American boys to fight in Europe. So, and he and Churchill were communicating, obviously, during that period. So tell us a little bit about that relationship. Were they really friends? Did they respect each other? I mean, these were two pretty larger than life characters. And how did they get along? And did they get along? And did that friendship help make a difference to the way things turned out?
Well, Churchill certainly thought he was larger than life. So the way yeah. What's so interesting to me, I didn't really anticipate that would be such a prominent sub-theme in the book. But as I found, Churchill became prime minister on May 10, 1940, which was the day that the so-called phony war became a very hot war, with Churchill invading, Hitler invading the Low Countries and so forth. But within, I believe it was the next day, maybe it's 48 hours, but at any rate, Churchill was shaving. And his son Randolph came in and was just sitting there talking to him, talking about the war and the fortunes of the war, future of it. And Churchill was quite confident that Britain would win, and Randolph was skeptical. He said, "But I understand how we could probably fight the Germans to a draw and just keep on fighting forever, but I don't see how you're going to manage to prevail." And Churchill, Randolph's father, Churchill, throws his razor into the sink, whirls around, faces Randolph, and says, "I shall drag America in." This is from day one. And he began this very meticulous, almost actually methodical courtship of Roosevelt. He himself later wrote that no lover pursued the target of his affections more ardently or more assiduously than he pursued Roosevelt. So, so it was a very, very close relations. Were they friends? I don't know. It's very hard to quantify that, because you sort of have to get into their heads and say, well, am I a friend of Churchill's or am I a friend of Roosevelt's? But they were close. And eventually they got onto the same circuit. Of course, after the action in my book, there was a certain amount of resentment, in the sense that Roosevelt was kind of taking over the whole show, and Churchill, above all, wanted to be running this war. But the pursuit of Roosevelt was, honestly, they might as well have been, having dinner over candlelight half the time, because it was a real seduction.
One of the library patrons asked that you have a brief piece towards the end of the book about the night at Pearl Harbor, when in fact Roosevelt and Churchill communicate by phone, and but there have been other accounts apparently of that evening in England, in which in fact there was like a celebration that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. You certainly don't make it sound that way. What was your understanding of what happened that night?
I consider my account to be a really spot on in terms of what did happen. As the celebration, there was no hiding the fact that Churchill was delighted that this had happened, and that the people who were there with him at Chequers when he found out, including Avril Harriman, everybody understood the real meaning of this. It's hard for us, I think, to conceive of this, but that night, among Churchill's advisors, with Churchill himself, suddenly there was no doubt what the outcome of the war was going to be. The only question was, how long? Was there celebration? There was celebration. I mean, everybody was delighted, and they sent off a telegram to Harry Hopkins in Washington, who had been a special emissary to London, and expressed their satisfaction and wishing that they were all together for this special night. Was it perceived to be an exceptionally positive experience, moment? Of course, yes.
Yeah. You alluded earlier to one of the things that you set out to do, and the thing that interested you the most about Churchill was, how, in fact, what was the mystery? How did he get through it? How did he do this? How did he lead? How did he, given who he was? So, what's the answer? What do you think? Is there a soundbite answer as to what it was? What was the secret sauce that he had?
Half the time, I think the solution was alcohol. I think that a lot comes down to that ineffable quality called character. I mean, Churchill had character. Where this came from, you can argue endlessly nature versus nurture and so forth, but he had character, he had stamina, he had courage, he had intellect, he had all that in the stew that came together to make him a terrific leader. However, acknowledging that there are lots of people who have all those qualities who are not good leaders. But somehow, and actually, we need to backtrack a little also and say that, Churchill was the man for this hour, but prior to that, he was kind of a screw up. And even after the war, he did some highly questionable things. And let's make note also that he was voted out of office before the war came to an end, because the public realized that they needed somebody more, let's say, stable to run the empire in the post-war era. But I think it does come down essentially to character. And of course, to the experience of being in the public milieu and having the words to persuade people.
You do, aside from the Churchill family, you've got a whole lot of really interesting vignettes about people who clearly were far less known to history in the book. Is there one or two of them that you think would be representative that you'd like to tell us about?
Oh, see, this is kind of what I love about history, especially writing known history, but finding new stuff. One of my objectives was to bring forward these characters are often given short shrift in Churchill biographies and so forth, for the simple reason that if you're going to give everybody equal room, you're going to end up writing a 15,000 page, biography, which actually has been done. But it's these characters who really, I think, provide nuance and texture. But I think of, I mentioned the prof, he's terrific, this dour vegetarian who everybody hated. And then Beaverbrook, who is this dynamic character who everybody also hated, and who one minister described as he described him as a ghoul, So there were those, but I think my favorite of the cast, of the secondary supporting cast, is John Colville, who was one of Churchill's very hard-working cadre of private secretaries, young men, all men, who were really essentially apprentice prime ministers, as best I can describe it. So Colville, every historian who has ever written about Churchill cites Colville's diary. But I decided, and what, by the way, it's a brilliant diary. It's really a rich day by day look into 10 Downing Street. It's the thing that gives us all a real sense of what actually was going on at 10 Downing Street during this period. But every historian has quoted Colville in passing, has referred to some of his descriptions, but I felt that John Colville wanted to step forward and become a character unto himself. And so John Colville becomes more of a living and breathing character. And I say character, I mean this in the nonfiction sense. He was a real individual, and I tried to capture his realness as best I could. But what I loved about Colville was that this diary was fantastic. I mean, details about politics, about events in the war, details about Colville's relationship with Clementine, who was Churchill's wife, all kinds of inter-family squabbles and so forth. It's the stuff that is just gold. But interestingly, because I had sort of decided I was going to bring John Colville, I wanted to bring John Colville forward. One day I was in the Cambridge Archives, the Churchill Archives in Cambridge College in Cambridge, and I was looking at the actual diary, and I was comparing it to the published diary, which is what everybody refers to, the published diary being the fringes of power. Now, everything that's in that published diary, except for some minor exceptions, actually appears in the original diary, but not everything that's in the original diary appears in the published diary. So that day in the Churchill Archives, I just decided, okay, I'm going to compare. I'm going to go through the whole thing. I'm going to compare and see what's missing. And it very quickly became apparent what was missing and what wasn't, because Colville, when he edited his diary, he did so with little light-colored pencil marks, and anything between those pencil marks was not in the published diary. So, of course, to me, that's the stuff I really
That was the
want
stuff
to
you
read.
wanted.
That's the juice, man. That's the juice. So I started reading all the stuff, and now in the published diary, and in introduction, if anybody reads that, will see him dismiss a lot of the stuff. He refers to this as he left out the trivialities, right? Blah blah blah. But boy, I can tell you that the material that he cut out at the time was not trivial to John Colville, because John Colville was in love. John Colville was in love. He was obsessively, passionately in love with a young woman who was not returning the interest. And to me, that's a universal, and that just had to be in the book, and it's in no other book. So I count that as kind of a coup also.
Yeah. You've one of the library patrons asked that, they said, must have seen you say this somewhere, that you didn't think of yourself as an historian, but a writer who writes history.
Yes.
You want to explain that distinction?
Well, clearly this is a person who went to one of my talks. So, yeah, I actually feel this very strongly. It is not my intent this may sound strange, it is not my intent when I write a book to inform, although my books will be packed with information, and if you want to quote them in your PhD thesis, I just go ahead, go absolutely wild. But my intention is rather to produce as rich a historical experience as I possibly can. My ideal is that readers will sink into the past so deeply that when they're done with the book, they come back with a sense of actually having lived in the past. Now, this is not at all about making stuff up. This is about going to great lengths in archives and so forth to find those little itty bitty telling details that can really, I think, shed light on a particular moment. So that's my goal.
Your books are full of lots of itty bitty details, and one of the things that I've always puzzled about: how do you keep track of it all? How do you keep track of the gazillion bits of information? Because this book, as the others, I mean, you have thousands of bits of information, and how do you go about researching? And two, how do you keep track of it, fresh in a way that you get it in right?
Well, let me tell you, as I get older and older, it's getting harder and harder. Although I do have a
I
system that
understand.
I do have a system that kind of strips memory out of the process. Because honestly, I've had a terrible short-term memory. I mean, since I was a kid, I don't know what it is. You know, that's why I could never even imagine becoming a concert pianist because I couldn't remember a single piece. You know what I mean? So I have a system that is designed to really sort of you know take the long route around memory. In the final phases of my research, I put all the interesting details, the best details, into what I refer to as into a chronology, and it's anything that has a time slot, anything that can be grouped in a particular time period, which is just about everything. And everything that I put in that chronology is coded to my collection of notes, all indexed in a very anal way that you don't even want to hear about. But in the end, I end up with this chronology. And by the way, this is a technique I learned from a homicide detective at my first newspaper job. Homicide detectives keep what's referred to as a murder book, in which at some point all the evidence that has a time attached to it is placed in chronological order so they can see what was happening when. So at the end of the process, when I have this chronology, it is, in the case of Splendid and the Vile, it's 185 single space pages long. It is a de facto outline because chronology is the single most important aspect of storytelling, I believe. So when you have this chronology with all the important facts and quotes and so forth lined up in this thing, and all coded so I can find instantly where that quote is, that's how I defeat my memory. I can see where the important nodes are. You know, when there are an awful lot of quotes and facts and so forth, that could be a chapter, or even better, there are references to a particular line of action, but then there's also a corresponding action elsewhere, like in Germany, in Joseph Goebbels' diary. And so all of that is really incredibly powerful. And that's the point where I finally feel that I can actually begin writing.
One of the, and perhaps it's a little trivial, but you have extraordinary detail about how Churchill entertained, and what the food that got served, and the liquor that got drank, and the fact that the cigars there seemed to be no shortage ever of a supply of all of those things. Was there ever, because clearly in London and during the Blitz, there were a lot of shortages, and a lot of everyday Londoners certainly didn't have access to the things that you described that were going on at 10 Downing Street or at Chequers. Was there ever any suggestion of impropriety or just some favoritism? How did he get all that stuff?
Well, first of all, interestingly, I mean, a lot of the luxuries, like champagne and these fancy, Havana cigars and so forth, weren't actually rationed. The things that were rationed were, bacon, eggs. These were the things that were really under heavy control. But Churchill and Clementine, for again aware of the power of symbolic acts, they were subject to rationing just like everybody else. But Churchill was the prime minister. When, for example, the car at Chequers was about to run out of the gas allotted on the petrol ration, all the housekeeper had to do was to write to the ministry that administered that and ask for more, which is not what the typical civilian could do. But one of the things that I love was when, Churchill was perpetually broke, first of all, and he entertained lavishly at Chequers and at 10 Downing Street. And he did not have the money to pay for this, and the government was not willing to do it either. But there was something called a government hospitality fund. And at one point, I talk about how the Churchills tapped into this hospitality fund for this lush list of fancy champagnes and whiskeys and brandies and so forth. But then also about how tightly they were controlled. These were put into the cellar at Chequers. and they were placed under very strict control. The Churchills had to inform this ministry, had to keep records of whom they served these wines to and how much, because they could only be served to foreign dignitaries. So of course Churchill made sure that there was a foreign dignitary present at just about every session in Chequers. But there were ways around it for the Churchills. You know, it's good to be the king, as they say.
Erik, I've always been curious. You know, each of your books, since Isaac Storm, through the Lusitania book and the Devil in a White City, and certainly the Devil in the Garden of Beasts, all about a certain period of time. You know,
Right.
from the late part of the 1800s to about 1940, 1945. Is there something about that time that had some special attraction and appeal to you?
Well, you know, if I had to pick a period that has a real special attraction for me, it was the Gilded Age, you know, which is essentially 1860 to 1900 thereabouts. That's my all-time favorite period. But you'll note that a lot of what I've done lately has actually been outside that period. I mean, here we've got Churchill in 1940. There was the Lusitania, you know, the 1915, and there was in the Garden of Beasts 1934. This is sort of a departure from my real interest in the Gilded Age. I would love to do another book in the Gilded Age for my next one, and I don't know, by the way, what I'm going to do next. The reason I love the Gilded Age is because it was a period when in America, people, you know, there was this sense that we could do anything we set our minds to. And as a consequence, people set out to do things that are incredible. Some worked, some didn't. And therein lies, hubris breeds great tragedy and great stories. And so that's really I think that's my all-time favorite period. It's also, incidentally, in this, anybody who writes history will second this idea. It was also the age of the typewriter. People had discovered the typewriter, and they used the typewriter to write their personal letters, to write their correspondence for business and so forth. God, it's just a lifesaver when you're doing research. Well, let me tell you, people who read Devil in the White City will remember, Frederick Law Olmsted, who's my favorite character in that book. But Olmsted's papers at the Library of Congress Manuscript Division, his handwriting is impossible to read. Impossible. It's like line by line fighting. So anyway, I love the Gilded Age. Love the Gilded Age.
I know it's not good form to ask a writer what's next, but are there other historical characters that you've thought about, that you think that there has been either less written about, figures that would warrant an Erik Larson treatment? Are there people out there that you think either well-known or more obscure that kind of interest you, that you'd like to know more about?
Well, I'm not so interested in I never approach books from the perspective of writing about people. What draws me is story. What is the story? What's the narrative arc or engine? Is it compelling in itself? Something that people is going to in and of itself compel people to read it, and then come the characters who populate that story. Who are the key players? And they could be minor characters. They could be, as in the case of Dead Wake, they could be President Wilson and his lover Edith Galt. To get back to your question, I mean, I've always had a thing for Theodore Roosevelt, but there too, I mean, honestly, so much.
Few books about it.
So much is done for. However, I mean, somebody may come up with Candace Millard, who I think is a fantastic writer of history. I wonder if she sort of feels the same way as I do, but she wrote River of Doubt, and it was a whole new lens on Teddy Roosevelt. So who knows? But I find him fascinating. I also find FDR still infinitely fascinating. I mean, just especially the whole polio part of his life. But again, these things have been done. So.
So we're almost out of time, but I would, the bookseller in me can't help but ask, tell us what you're currently reading and what are you looking forward to that's either just out or about to come out? What's on your reading table?
Okay, so for pleasure reading, I only read fiction. I only read fiction. I have to get away from, from my workshop materials, from reading nonfiction, some of which is actually often quite terrible, but sometimes it's the terrible nonfiction that yields the best little nuggets of fact that you just wouldn't believe. But so I read fiction for pleasure, and I'm reading now. I just started reading an Alan First novel. I love Alan First's novels. This is called The Paris Occupation. I'm 10 pages in, so. But recently I finished, I've read some I think maybe this is pandemic speaking, I don't know, but I just finished reading The Lord of the Flies by William Golding. And I'd read that long ago, and I'll tell you, it came to me with a whole new vividness now. And there is a shift in point of view, POV, in the last 4 pages of that book that I don't think I'd ever really paid that much attention to. And reading it now, I was blown away. Wow, that was a complete change of point of view. And that, you know what I mean if you've read The Lord of the Flies.
Oh, yeah.
And then one thing I like to shout out to certain books, but in the last 6 months, I mean, 2 books that to me stand out as some of the best things that I've ever read. One, of course, is A Gentleman in Moscow by Immortal. It's a book that I find actually magical. And I've told him so. We've actually become friends. Another is News of the World by Paulette Giles, a little book, but fantastic. So anyway, that's it. What are you reading?
Given this, I went back and there was the HBO series about of the Philip Roth book about so I went back and reread that, which of course has some interesting parallels to your story. Of course, in the fictional account, Roosevelt doesn't win that election in 1940. But I went back and reread The Plot Against America, which I thought was a pretty telling, pretty telling to read. Well, Eric, look, this has been great. I know my friends in White Plains are delighted that you were able to make yourself available. Again, we're really sorry that we're not with you on Martin Avenue at the library, but we certainly issue an invitation and do hope that at some point we will see you up here in White Plains. And thank you for this, and thank you for all the extraordinary work that you do, and keep them coming.
Well, thank you, Oren. Thanks for taking the time to do this. Thank you all.
It's been fun. Let me turn this back to Nancy Rubini from the White Plains Library Foundation. Nancy? We have you, Nancy. Are you there?
I don't know. Am I there?
Yes, you are. Go for it.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. That was fascinating and timely. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. There's over 100 people in this program right now, and most of us are donors to the White Plains Library Foundation. And because of you, the foundation has a 25-year track record of fundraising for the library. And so we're well positioned to continue to help the library during these challenging times. Thank you so much for your generosity. It's really important to us that we can stay connected to you now so that we can share information about what's happening at the library and activities of the foundation. And the best way to stay connected is through our newsletter. So if you're not a subscriber, please sign up on the library's homepage. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Take care, everybody. Good night.
Yeah, everybody stay home.
Stay home.